Hey, this is the EconBros podcast, and my name is Gokul, and my co-host here's name is.
Manish.
And we have a special guest here. His name is Wesley. So do you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, Gokul. I'm Manish. My name is Wesley Ng, originally from Vancouver, Canada, but now I live in San Francisco working as a consultant at McKinsey and Company. Previously, I was a business lead and development manager at Poof Payments, which is a crypto fintech payment startup, as well as recently graduated from my MBA at Berkeley Haas. Super excited to chat.
Yeah, we're actually super excited too. So, actually, I want
Yes.
to ask about your experience in your colleges that you went to. So, in UC Berkeley, how was that? Just the experience overall.
That's a good question. So I went to UC Berkeley as a MBA student, a master's in business administration. And previously, for my undergrad, I studied economics at the University of British Columbia in Canada, in Vancouver. And there I did an economics degree. So I think the biggest difference is first and foremost that one is a undergrad degree and one's a graduate degree. And so I think the level of intensity is a little bit different. The level of rigor, I think what type of kind of like the objective of your learning is different. I would say more so in the bachelor's degree, it's really having a foundational understanding of whatever topic you're trying to learn. So in my case, it was economics. And so we went really deep into the foundations like Econ 101s plus math and statistics and basic business foundations. For the MBA, it was, yes, there was learning elements of it. And so a lot of people were coming from different backgrounds, whether it's people who worked previously in business, you have scientists, teachers, people from the armed forces, just a really wide varying degree of background. So part of the MBA is to help those people who don't have experience get at that same level of foundational learning. But then there's also these other elements such as networking and knowing people in the business, as well as really focusing on career building. So a lot of people say worked at startups, a lot of people founded their own companies. A lot of people spend a lot of time recruiting and getting to know other jobs that they might want to do.
So why'd you choose your specific major that you did in your undergrad?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I chose economics. I was considering a lot of different areas, whether it be, say, more on the social sciences side, which include economics, such as sociology. I was also considering more technical degrees, such as computer science or engineering. For me personally, the major distinction was I felt that I would be good at engineering and science degrees. I knew I didn't want to do medical fields such as being a doctor. I knew that I liked math, but also I would say, at least within my high school classmates, I felt like I wasn't the best, which now looking back isn't the best reason to not do something. But I felt I was also extremely interested in economics, and I had a strong interest in history and politics, and this idea about how society worked. And so I read a lot of books around sociology, I read a lot of books around economics, and I felt like economics was that blend of human interactions with math. And so that's what I liked about it. It helped me, I think, explain the way certain things work, such as why do things cost the way they do? Why do governments act the way they are? Why do people feel the way they are? But more in a macro sense instead of individual psychological or society.
So what led you to your MBA? What was your goal for that?
So I did my MBA after working for around three or 4 years in the field. And for me, it was just trying to understand more so what I wanted to do. I used the time a lot to explore. I knew I was a strong interest in technology. And so that was my kind of time to just explore working in that space. So during that time, I did a couple startups, plus worked for a couple other startups, and talked with a lot of industry professionals. And I realized like going into a certain like hypothesis, like did I want to be a product manager? Did I want to be a business development person? Did I want to be a startup founder? And I think like by having time to test it out, then it makes me more certain about what I want to do long term. So that was kind of the main reason. I think the second reason is I was originally working in Vancouver, so moving to the US was a really nice option, and lets you kind of like open your horizons.
Yeah. So I have like a fun question to ask you. Like, I'm just curious, if you ever like wrote a book, like what would it be about? It could be a hobby, maybe something you're passionate about. Like, it's just a curious question to see the type of personality you have.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think there'd be two types of books. One would be, so I really like history, so I think I would love to write a book about the history during like pre-World War II China. I think it's like a really interesting time phase when the country was growing a lot and changing from like from a monarchy to a republic. And then you have all these other people talking about like wanting to be communists, and there's a lot of like internal conflict. So I find that time period really interesting. I think the second book would be maybe a book around like young adult leadership, because I think it's a really interesting one where leadership is always a concept in my mind about like someone who has to be very on top of things, very senior. It's usually like the most oldest person in the room, or that's like a perspective I had when I was growing up. But I do think for me it means something different now, especially like I think for more junior tenured people, that there's ways you can be a leader that isn't, speaking the most or being the loudest. And so I think that's a really interesting topic, and I think a lot of leadership books are really focused on getting you from wherever you are to becoming like a CEO or like the boss. But not everyone's the boss, and not everyone it's not always like relevant. So I think that's probably like another book I would write or be interested in writing.
Okay. Yeah, so let's switch gears and now let's talk about like mentorship. I know you did a lot of mentorship. So ideally, I had a couple of questions like, what inspired you to be a mentor, and what qualities did you have to become a mentor yourself?
So I think maybe talking about like the inspiration part first. I think everyone like gets help on where they're going. Whether it's like from your family, from your friends, from people outside your network. And I think that's a big part around like in my sense of like fairness is, a lot of people are born into places where they have a lot of opportunity already. As in, hey, your dad might work at this company, your uncle or your aunt might have this like friends. And so I always thought that like, oh, that's like interesting, but how about all the other people who don't have access to that? I think that's where I felt like mentorship really helped. And like growing up, I was fortunate to have some people who knew that space, but honestly, no one around my like friend or family circle knew what consulting was. And so I really had to like leverage my network within the university community. And I think part of that was, those people used to be students and they're now helping current students. And so I wanted to do the same. And I felt that like so many people helped me, and I wanted to be someone who could help others get to the like similar position. And so like, that's kind of the main inspiration why I think that's the part of work that I enjoy the most, whether it's mentorship formally within my work or outside with different communities. So for example, like me and Gokul did Polygents, which I thought like is a really fun experience in helping people develop their like intellectual academic curiosities. And then I also did a lot of stuff around consulting mentorship as well as some other programs. And you asked a question about like what qualifies you to be a mentor. I think other than just having the interest, the only other thing I would say is having a perspective or some guidance that someone else wants. And it doesn't really like require much. Like you two could be mentors to say someone who is just starting high school, because there's so much from their perspective that they would love to hear. Like obviously everyone is like always learning more, like myself, you two, but you don't have to like know everything. You just have to know incrementally a little bit more than the other person, because to them you are already so helpful and such a nice like guiding force for them. So I always think like people, and this applies to like many different areas, feel like they need to be overly qualified for certain things. But I think being a mentor is just honestly just like showing up, being someone who will like listen, and having some advice to provide. I don't think there's anything more than that. Like now there are good mentors and there are bad mentors, but I think all it takes is just showing up.
That's great, because like when you were helping me, like I did like realize like a mentor is like you don't even have to know like everything. You just have to just be there and listen, and you just have to know like what exactly. That's what I felt. I was like, hey, you just have to listen.
Gotta give advice.
Exactly, yeah. It was good.
You asked the right questions. Yeah.
I want to like talk about like your consulting field, and maybe like you can even give advice to the people who's watching this. Like, how did you even get into like consulting? Like, just the basic question.
Yeah, and maybe first off, maybe I'll talk about what consulting is, because I think like it's a very ambiguous term. Yeah. So it's a complicated industry to like describe for people who don't know it. I think first and foremost, like consultants, there's many different types of consultants. I would say there's broadly like two categories. There's technical, like specialist consultants, and then we would call them general management or management consultants. So I am at McKinsey, I am a management consultant, but within the firm, we have many different types of consultants. We also have people who are very technical, very specialist. So specialist consultants are usually people who like have deep expertise in the industry. So like they worked in, say, for example, semiconductors for 20 years. And so they have this like piece of knowledge that people really want. The other hand, there's kind of more so management consultants who will help provide more general expertise onto a certain problem. So maybe, for example, if you are like Target and you want to develop a new, you're thinking of offering a credit card. Target isn't a credit card company. And so they might not have the expertise or people that knows how to do that. And so someone like a consulting firm might offer their services and be like, well, we have people who've done this before, and like let our team help you, instead of you having to hire like 5 people who are experts, and then after your project is over, like let them go. So in many ways, we provide a lot of like help to companies who have problems. So I guess to your question about how is the process of getting into consulting, it's I would like be honest, like it's quite tough. Like I think it's quite rigorous, because you're expected to provide a lot of insights and problem solving to clients, and that's what we value the most. Is, are you a good problem solver? Can you help your clients and kind of coach them along the way? And so I think it requires like a really good intellectual like ability. Like, are you good at math? Are you good at problem solving? I think B, it's communication skills. So I think you generally need to have pretty good people skills to do this job, because it's not just about showing up and being like, oh, this is the answer. It's about working with your client to help them get to the point where you and them feel comfortable about the answer and want to do it. I would always say like it's not really about um, giving the right answer. It's about working together to get to there. Because if they don't believe it's the right thing or they don't feel comfortable with it, then it's the exact same thing of you not being able to help them. I think lastly, consulting is a job where you're not like the the boss in the scenario. Like you're in the advisor. You're not the rock star. You're like the supporter. So I think it does take a certain like personality. Like in a sense, like we might help a company turn around and like help them build up new capabilities and new initiatives. But once we help them and they don't need our help anymore, then we leave. Like we move on. Like we might stay in touch, but we feel like our job is done. So we're never there when things are really good because you don't really need us. And so I think it's a certain type of personality who's okay with that. Some people like want to build something and like enjoy that success over time. And so I think that's the other element of it. So those are the kind of, I would say, like the qualities of someone who's interested in it. Why I think it's a good job is you get to have a lot of experience in many different industries. So I got to work in like dairy, banking, finance, mining, tech, consumer products, just a lot of different areas. And I think for someone, especially coming out of undergrad, it's like a really good way of trying many different things. Like, especially since it's hard to know what you want to do until you do it and just like get a taste of it. Maybe you want to try it and then you realize right away you don't want to do it, but that's better than trying to get into the job and then once you're in the job, like realizing you hate it.
So like, what were the challenges I guess you faced when you were like you guys starting to join the consulting firm?
Within the consulting firm, I would say confidence is definitely one because you're put in the rooms of, very high level leadership executives on the client side quite early. And I think it's important to realize how you can add value in the situation. Like, yes, you might not be the expert, but you might be able to help the clients work on their analysis or gather the data and work with your internal experts to give them the right answer. And so it's like knowing how to provide value. And a lot of times, I think part of it is trying to think, like sometimes clients are so into their problem that they can't just step back a little bit. And I'm sure you two have experienced this where you're like just looking at this thing for so long and then someone comes in and just like, oh, why don't you do this? And it just like magically makes sense. And that's like part of it, which is like you kind of have a little bit of a step back perspective of the problem, which can be helpful in providing that from like fresh eyes. So I think a very like common thing about an outsider's perspective is that like usually if you have worked in the industry, you define a problem very similarly. Like, for example, if you worked in the hotel industry and then someone's like, oh, I'm going to make an app about helping people find places to stay for their vacation, then your instant gut is that this is going to be an app that helps me find hotels, right? It's a hotel booking app. But if you're from outside the industry, well, your perspective isn't, oh, this needs to be a hotel booking app. It could be like, well, I just want to find a place to stay. Like sometimes I go couch surfing. Sometimes I like want to go somewhere and stay at a motel. Sometimes I do want to stay at a hotel, but it might be expensive. Sometimes I see if I have friends. And so then you like might think of something like Airbnb, like, oh, well, it could be something more like open. And so like, I think that's like part of the perspective that consultants bring is that I know your problem, but I'm also not like as deep into the weeds as you. And like, let me help you and like get the knowledge I need to help you and bring in the right resources. But sometimes it's nice to just be a little bit farther away.
So, what advice would you even give to the people? Let's just say someone wants to be a consultant, a management consultant. What advice would you give to that person who's trying to get into that?
I talk to a lot of people in the industry. Like, I think it's a good thing to try and get a sense of what you're getting into. I think secondly is practice. So typically consultant interviews have a kind of personal interview and also a case, like a consulting case. And it's similar to like the SATs where even if you're really bright, it just takes some repetitions to get really good at it. And so I would say like talk to people who you know have done it and try to like learn a lot about that interview preparation. I also would say if you like doing cases, then it's a good signal that you like doing on-the-job problem solving. Consulting is an industry that's very like ambiguous. You know, like usually the problems aren't really well defined, and so some people hate that. Some people are like, I don't have all the information. I don't feel comfortable talking. Like, I want something a little bit more simple. But if you like more like ambiguous problem solving, I think it's a really interesting industry.
Okay. Yeah, so can you share some tips for like networking and building like successful like consulting career, especially like building and maintaining like client relationships with your client?
Maybe I'll talk about like networking more generally first. It's like an interesting thing. I think networking is such an interesting term, and like I think at the end of the day, like if we like take a step back, networking is really just making connections with people. And when we call it networking, it seems really formal and like quite stuffy. I think a lot of times just like saying hi to people, you know, making a connection, keeping in touch with people. And so, you know, there's this idea that, oh, if you know, think that networking, like, or people sometimes think it's like overly transactional. Sometimes people think it's like, you know, you should make it very genuine. I'm gonna like kind of draw a line where I think it's kind of both, where everyone kind of knows it's a little bit transactional. As in, you know, I want to get to know you because I want to build my network and know more people. But the reason you want to know more people is that you have access to more opportunities. Likewise for the other person. Likewise, there's a reason they want to network with you. And it could just be like as simple as, you know, I like knowing more people that I can mentor. Maybe in the future they become someone that is helpful for me. But it's also the case that, well, I just enjoy having the conversation. So I think part of that, my takeaway for that is don't overly engineer the process. I think it's as simple as saying hi, and like telling them why you want to connect. But also being like a good person about it. I think sometimes when people network, it's quite aggressive or overly prescriptive. I think be respectful about it. Know your value, be respectful. I think coming from like a high school or university student perspective, yes, like you don't have a career, you don't have the same things, but you can still be very respectful about it. I will say, like, a lot of people will like ignore you and turn you down, but I think it's important to be persistent.
So I had another question about like how do you balance your career with like maintaining a healthy work life, and like what strategies do you have as like a professional growth type?
It's kind of just knowing what you want. You know, some people are okay with just working really hard, and if that's what you want, then that's okay. But if you feel like very uncomfortable with it, if you feel burnt out, then you kind of need to know you need to change. I think companies are a lot better with setting boundaries. But the thing is, if you don't set a boundary for yourself, no one's going to respect that. So if the boss is like, well, like how long is this going to take? Like how much work can you do tonight? And you're like, well, I can finish it all. Well, then you're kind of like setting up yourself for that type of expectation. But if you tell the manager like, oh, I have dinner with my friends I really want to catch, then and or like this is my parents' birthday or my dad's birthday, then it's a conversation. At least you can have the conversation. So I think it's very important to set that boundary for yourself of like, no, I'm not gonna do this, or I'm not gonna do that.
And then I had a question about McKinsey, about like what sets them apart from like other like firms in the same industry.
Um, it's a funny question because obviously I'm biased and I haven't worked for the other big ones too, but I can talk about my own experiences and what I see is different. I think that one thing is generally it's one of the more well-known, if most like best well-known firms, and so I think that's one area that's a little bit different. I think the other area is that we tend to we're pretty global and we act as like kind of one big firm, which I really value. I can ask my colleagues in any different office to help out. People are super excited. So like last week I had some work that I needed help with, and there was an expert in Germany, and so I just sent them an email. Like, I've never met them, but they were super kind and helpful. I think the last thing is we tend to focus a lot on kind of being a thought leader in the space. So we have a thing called like the McKinsey Global Institute, which is basically our think tank arm, and they put a lot of like really good research on such things as like the future of Gen AI, or how we expect to solve certain like global problems like sustainability, but also other areas such as like diversity, equality, and inclusion within the workplace. And so I generally feel like those things are some stuff that other firms have, but maybe I notice it more strongly in McKinsey. But again, that's coming from my own bias perspective.
Yeah, so we talked about like, your McKinsey consulting, and then I kind of want to talk about your experience in like the crypto startup you had. Do you mind just giving us like a background of what was that?
Yeah, so I worked at a crypto fintech startup called Proof Payments. We helped, basically we're a payments gateway, so we help businesses accept different forms of payments. And our vision is basically creating a platform that allows anyone to accept any different types of form of payments and pay out in any form of different payment. So, like that could be crypto, that could also be like other things. So like, why can't you pay for your coffee in like Cash App payments? Like, why can't you pay in like Google Pay or PayPal or like anyone you want? Why do you have to be so like choosy about it? So that's kind of like our idea, because at the end of the day, like some groups, like consumer groups prefer certain payment methods. So it makes a question of like, why can't you just do whatever you want? So we're working on that like interoperable layer.
So maybe like, why did you like work there? Like, what was your reason to help them with this?
Yeah, so I started in roughly the start of my MBA, and I think part of it was I was really interested in crypto, and so I wanted some crypto experience, and so I also really enjoyed fintech, working in fintechs, and
okay, sorry.
You can go ahead, Manish.
Yeah, so I was also gonna ask you, like, what did you learn from crypto startup, and like, how did these experiences shape you as a fintech and crypto mindset?
Yeah, so I think crypto is really interesting. I think like I joined during the last like bull run, and now it's kind of in the crypto winter. And I think what I learned is that I still think crypto has its place. I still think it's a very powerful technology. I do think that there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of people who are like selling stuff that doesn't really make value. And so I think it's actually a really good illustration of like first principles thinking, which is, like if someone's like, hey, you should buy this stock, and they're like, why should I buy this stock? they're like, well, everyone's buying it, and all the other stocks that are like it are going up. Like, is that a good reason? Like, is that a good reason to invest in that company? Maybe or maybe not. But you have to think like, well, what does the company do? And you might be thinking, well, it's really good at selling its own stocks, and that's how it's making money. Well, you have to think like, does it actually value people? Like, am I actually providing someone that actually like makes people's lives like better? And I think that's the problem with a lot of crypto stuff, which is people are so hyped up about the technology and how everyone is using it, but the fact that, or adopting it or talking about it, but I don't think like a lot of true thinking was on, oh, is this actually better than what is out there? So like, I think a good example is NFTs. NFTs are like a really interesting technology, but the use case that people were using it for was like collectibles. Like, oh, like Gokul has a picture of his face as an NFT. And that is so valuable because it's an NFT and I can trade it. But you have to think like, well, can I just take a picture of someone's face and just send it to someone and it's like the same value? And so, yeah, like, but there's also technologies where it's really cool, which is like, I could use NFTs for movie tickets or concert tickets, right? So if you think about it, like Taylor Swift recently had her concert, or is having her concert tour. Tickets retail maybe at $300, but then people like resell them, and they resell them up for like $1,000, $2,000. But you have to think of like who's getting that money, right? You know, Taylor Swift is getting $300, but then I buy it and I resell it to Manish for $1,000. So in a sense, I'm getting like $700 from that transaction. But all I did was I got in front of the line, bought the ticket, and then found someone to buy it, sell it. But Manish is going to go to a concert, watch Taylor Swift, and it's going to be like Taylor Swift who's putting on all this value, right? She's the one that people want to see. I didn't really do anything. I just got in the middle. So then it's like, well, as an NFT, you could use the technology to be like, well, every time this NFT is transferred, Taylor Swift gets a cut. So then it's like, well, I sell it back to Manish, you know, I sell it for $1,000, Taylor Swift gets a 10% cut on every transaction. At least she's getting a little bit more from that value, right? You can make it 20%, whatever. So I think that's a really interesting one. Like, but again, people really focused on use cases that weren't super important, like actually helpful for people.
So I know you said one side like crypto has like there's a lot of hype, and one side, you know, you think it's like good for the future, it's a good technology. So in your perspective, how do you view crypto or NFTs in the future? What do you see it?
I think payments is like obviously like in a sense it's like a transfer of value that you need to like really trust. So I think like more like anything that, hey, I want to provide like transfer ownership to you. So for example, right now there's like a lot of like conflicts in the world, like Ukraine, in Israel, Gaza. And so I think Ukraine is a really interesting one because say Russia invaded and then they took over Crimea, which used to be part of Ukraine. And then so it's like one government to another government, right? And then so, you know, maybe you had a house on the beach in Ukraine, you know, and it's like a really nice house. And then, you know, you had the paper contract like saying this is Gokul's house. And then, you know, suddenly the government changed. There's a new government. And then the Russians come in. And then Manish is like, he's Russian. And he's like, Gokul, I really like your house. I'm going to take it from you. Right. And he takes the paper. Right. And it's like, well, that kind of sucks. You know, Gokul has to find a new house. And then the Ukrainians come back in and they take over the country. They take over Crimea again. And then it's like, well, who owns the house? Right. You know, Gokul used to own the house, but Manish has the paper. And then, well, Manish will be like, well, Gokul sold it to me. But there's no like transaction record. And then Gokul, you're going to be, well, he stole it from me. And so I think that's why like crypto is really interesting. Well, because that could be all like online and a contract that's tracked. And so it's really interesting for some things like property rights. I think it's also a really interesting thing for like transferring value to just money, because like same way if this was like gold, Gokul like gold, and then Manish stole your gold, then it's like, well, obviously we know, like for example with like a Bitcoin, it's like it's hard to steal. It is really really hard to steal stuff like that.
So you don't have to talk specifically in like you're the crypto startup, but how do you like, I guess, go through like the challenges of like the laws of doing that, like using crypto transactions from like the government? Because I know like usually like crypto it's a new product, I guess, relatively new. So how do you like, bypass like the laws that's always been for other types of transactions like cash or whatever?
Yeah, I would say first, like it's not about bypassing regulations. I think it's like understanding them. And again, this is like an area that's like very just like dynamic. It's like just changing all the time. And so there's like recent regulation that basically anytime you have to make a transaction on an exchange, you have to have a kind of KYC profile, which means like know your customer. So previously, if I used any exchange or some exchanges, they wouldn't have to know who's buying what. So like Gokul can buy Bitcoin from Manish for Ethereum, and that trade just happens on the web, and no one knows. Like there's just a number for Gokul, there's just a number for you.
Yeah.
And so like I think it's just about like understanding the regulations. I think the big companies are trying to like push it. It's more like a conversation, I would say. And so you know, one side is trying to push their perspective, the other side is trying to push their perspective. I'll probably end up somewhere in the middle at the end of the day. You know, there's also this element of like crypto is just not US centric, it's also global. And so, you know, that's a part that's really interesting, which is like, well, if I could just do international transactions, like where does this fall legally? And so I think like a lot of crypto companies had a hard time because they just ignored it, which I don't think you should ignore it.
So at the start, I know you said the reason you went to this field, crypto field, is you were interested. For people who are, I guess, interested, and what advice would you give them in the crypto field? I know it's like it's a lot of information, super like it's a new like thing. So like, what advice would you give to them? Like,
I would say like anything is just first before like wanting to try getting into it is just use it. Like create a wallet, buy some crypto, do a transaction. You know, use it for like buying something online, just to like know how it feels, right? It's like saying like, hey, I wanted to work as a software engineer, or I want to make video games. I'll be a video game designer, but you never played video games, you know. So I think the first one is just like play around with it, get to know it, get to know what people are talking about, and then secondly, then you can start like reaching out to like helping out. There's always like a tons of like small projects within crypto, and they always need some help, whether it's like marketing, whether it's like community building. Those are areas where if you're not technical, I think are easy to help out in.
So I kind of want to like switch into like the economic side of this and ask you a couple questions for the audience, and you can explain these things. And I just want to ask, like, why do you, in your personal opinion, like, why do you think economics or the field is important in society or just anywhere?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I like knowing stuff.
Yeah.
I like knowing how things work. And there's a lot of things that are outside of your control that really impact your life. So mortgage rates, like you guys are not at the age yet, but if you're thinking about getting a house, you know, mortgage rates really matter. So for example, right now mortgage rates are like 5 to 7%. Maybe a year ago, they were like 2%. And so if you had a house at the 2% rate, you might be paying like $3,000, for example. You might buy the same house at the same value, but then your mortgage would go up to like $6,000, $7,000 in the same house. it just doubles, triples, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the mortgage rate
Yeah.
just doubles, triples. And again, it's not like you're using that money to pay off your mortgage principal, so like the amount you borrowed. It's just interest. It's just going to the bank. And so like that stuff matters so much. It will like literally like change your life from going from like, hey, I'm paying 2,000, 3,000 to I'm paying like 6,000, 7,000 a month. Because that could be your whole salary. So I think like understanding why that is, like not to, for example, to like forecast it, but just understanding like, oh, am I being like screwed over by like someone? Like why is this happening to me? So I think that's why like economics, I think it's also very interesting from a like historical, political point of view. Things like, why do certain countries have certain policies? Like I'm from Canada and we have like free healthcare, almost free. And so it's understanding like why does that work? Why does it not work in the US? Why does it work in other countries? So I think those questions for me are like really interesting, and studying economics gives me like a little bit of a framework to understand things. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was gonna ask you about like overall, like I know you're saying you're really into economics, so like what are some like significant like indicators of like the health economy?
Yeah, the health of the economy. Again, I'm not an economist, but I like economics. I think simple things like inflation, interest rates are really important. Unemployment. I think like consumer spending is really interesting. Savings rate is really interesting. Like consumer spending itself is like, you know, it's just how much people are willing to spend, and it's such like a subjective concept that we like try to take like, oh, maybe like last month you're very confident like, oh, I'm gonna get more money, so I'm gonna spend more. Like, oh, I'm gonna buy a new car, I'm going to buy new shoes or new shirt, or like I'm gonna buy like a PlayStation. You know, like when do you make that decision of being like comfortable of like buying a PlayStation and not comfortable? And so I think those things are really interesting because, you know, for everyone it's kind of like, it's like hard to pinpoint. It's like kind of this like nebulous feeling of like, maybe I am, maybe I won't. But then if you like take everyone's decisions about that, like, you know, if like 20% more people buy PlayStations, that's a lot of more PlayStations being bought. And so for me, that's always interesting of like watching that, of like how much consumer spending is going up or down. But again, like I think there's a lot of interesting ones. People maybe gravitate towards like certain fun ones, like the Big Mac Index, which talks about like the price of Big Macs across the world, like in US dollar terms. Like for example, in like Iceland, it's really expensive, and the US is kind of cheap. But yeah, they're like, why is that case? Like, is it labor costs? Is it, you know, food costs? Is it exchange rate? So I think there's like a lot of interesting ones that you could pick at.
Oh, very nice. So what does like inflation and unemployment rate mean actually, and how do they correlate? Like I remember you were talking about it, so.
Yeah, so like inflation is just like the if you take a look at a basket of goods in the market, looking at the price and how much it increases over time. Interest rate talks about the rate that people lend out money. So typically it's like, you know, 1 to 10 to 5%. And they correlate because if you're borrowing at a low, if money is like really cheap, so interest rates kind of price of money. If interest rate's really low, then it doesn't cost you anything to borrow money. So if interest rate is 0%, I borrow $100 from you. 10 years later, I can give it back to $100. So why wouldn't I borrow the $100, right? But if everyone borrows $100 at 0% rate because it's so cheap, then, you know, everyone's competing for the same price. So like, for example, like I want to buy a PlayStation, but everyone else wants to buy a PlayStation, then the price is going to go up. So that's kind of how it's related. And usually if you increase the interest rate, inflation goes down. But nowadays it's not as, like the connection is not as strong. I'd say economic theory dictates that happens. But, you know, a lot smarter people are having problems to understand why it's not happening.
Yeah. So Gokul, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I also wanted to ask, like, So for the people who actually just want to get into this field,
Mhm.
like why were you interested at the start? But then like, do you have any advice for the people who want to get into this? Like it low-key, it's really interesting to me. Like
Mhm.
see how things work, like from a top like macro, and then even to micro like behavioral economics too. So like, do you have any advice?
Yeah, I would say like I think like with a lot of things, people say start at like the principles.
Mm-hmm.
I actually say don't, like, because it's like kind of boring. I mean, it's interesting,
Mm.
but I think for a lot of people it's boring. I think get like excited about stories. So like I would listen to podcasts like Freakonomics, Planet Money. I think they're really good at making economics and business like story based, right?
Ah,
So talking
okay.
about like, oh well, this is Jim and this Jim had this issue, or like, you know, I think that's to me is like way more interesting because it makes it way more real and it makes
Mm.
it more relatable. So like you might learn things about like why, um, like how all the NFL teams are pretty much like the most socialist business in the US because they just share all their revenues. Majority of the revenues they share equally. Even if you're the worst team, you share it. You get like the same proportion as the best team. Or like how like the Canadian dairy market is like supply managed. So like someone says like how much milk you can make. Like all these things are like little tidbits that like shape the economy. And so I would say like that to me is like probably the place I would get started.
Mm.
Yeah,
And
that
then,
was good advice for the people who are listening, even me too. So yeah, hey,
yeah,
Manish,
exactly.
Manish,
Yeah, so I was gonna ask, like, right, real quickly about like, do you recommend any books for kids that are interested in coming into economics as a major in college?
Yeah, I would say Freakonomics to me is probably like the most like interesting one.
Mm.
Um, and like talks a lot about that. My other suggestion um, would be I forgot the exact title, but it's like Tales or Stories of an Economic Hitman. Talks about how
Mm.
like these people would go into the Americans would go into like Latin America, provide a bunch of money and kind of enact policy change.
Okay.
But I would say I would go back to like Freakonomics. I think that one is like a really good source. Like they have really good storytelling.
yeah. So Wesley, that's actually like basically that's all the questions we wanted to ask at the end of the
Mhm.
podcast, I guess. But we have two more last questions. I just wanted we could get off with.
Yeah.
When you're like, I guess, like in your life, like when you're going through it, what is like your philosophy? Like you just it's something that's always in your mind, just looking out. Just, what is that? Like your philosophy of in life?
Mm, that's a very deep question.
Yeah.
I would say that one part is, um, being brave. I think sometimes when things are uncomfortable, that's when you're growing the most. And so I think a lot of people stray away from uncomfortable situations.
Mm.
But, the more you do that thing, the less uncomfortable it becomes, the more confident you are in it. So I would say that's the one thing. The other thing is um, your mindset. People's mindset matters so much in their life. If you believe that you're bad at math, you're probably going to be bad at math. You're going to go into the test being like, I don't know anything. Like, I'm not going to study. I'm bad at math. But it's really just like a mindset. And
Mm.
so in order for you to do anything, like you have to start believing that you can do it. And like this can take the form of like very simple stuff as in like visualization of like, hey, I'm gonna be playing basketball. And if you're always gonna picture in your head that you're gonna miss the shot, then you're gonna miss the shot, right? But you think like, okay, I'm gonna do this, and then the ball's gonna go in, then it helps you. It might not happen all the time, but it's gonna get you there versus not. So in life too, in like business or school or whatever, like I think that's also a good mentality, which is like believing that you're gonna do the things you want to do and believing you are that type of person.
Mm.
So I think it's, for example, with you two, like if you believe that you weren't good enough or like capable of making this podcast, then you probably wouldn't do it. There had to
Mhm.
be this like inspiration. And so
Yeah.
I think a lot of people kind of stop themselves from thinking that way. And so I
Yeah.
always say, if you want to talk to someone like a professional in the industry, like someone you think is really important, like think of yourself as someone who can talk to them. Don't think you're like, oh, I'm not good enough to talk to this person. Like they won't like talking to me. Well, then you're gonna be coming off as a person who they don't want to talk to. And so why would
Okay.
they? So I would say like your own personal mentality and of it is so important. And so like I think it's always like having confidence in yourself. The worst thing that happens is like someone doesn't want to talk to you, and it's pretty normal in life.
Yeah. All right. So last question is, we've been asking you like what advice you have for the audience. So like, what is any advice that you've gotten from someone else, maybe your mentor or a family member, like the best advice you've gotten from someone else?
Ooh, I think part in what I talked about is like knowing your own value and having boundaries. And again, people will treat you the way you want to be treated. People will treat you the way that you're okay letting them treat you. And so whether it's in like your friendships, your workplace relationships, your family, you know, if you let people, they will treat you the way they want to treat you. And so, for example, say like, you know, you have a boss or like you have a friend who keeps on like overstepping. Maybe they're always late, you know, and they're like, well, you know, Gokul's okay with me being late because he doesn't say anything. So maybe he's chill, you know, maybe he doesn't care. But maybe you care a lot. You're like, my time is valuable. You don't respect my time. This is like annoying me, frustrating. Like until you say something, then they won't change. And so I think that applies to so many things of, you know, knowing your own value and standing up for it. And so I would say that was a piece of advice that I really appreciated, especially like as I'm becoming older and more senior in the company. And so I would say like that applies like in all aspects, family, friends, workplace.
Yeah, definitely.
Wesley, that's the end of the podcast. Thank you for coming in. Do you have any last thoughts? Manish, do you have any last thoughts?
I'm all set. Thank you for hopping on this podcast.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you, Gokul and Manish, for organizing this. Like, super happy to chat with both of you about it. I think it was a lot of fun. And also, like, I think to anyone listening, happy to, they can send me an email. I think Gokul, you can like put my personal email or maybe my LinkedIn.
Yeah, I'll put that.
And then, yeah, happy to chat because I think going back to the mentorship piece. I'm always happy to like help other people just learn, and I think there's not enough of that in the world.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
Well, thank you so much. Well, have a great weekend, both of you.
Yep.